Hi, everybody.
Do I need this?
Oh, let me get your mic. Sorry.
Things have changed. Things are good the same way. If I have a pen, he needs a note.
Maybe just rest it down here. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Here, there is a note there.
How's that? Getting better? Okay, I'll try and speak up. Is this all right?
Good.
Great. So first of all, thank you for this invitation. I am so impressed with how well organized this is. I think I signed up last summer to come and present at this, so summer of 2017. I knew I was going to be here on 12/12/18. Felt very far away at the time, but I'm glad to be here and to have this delicious lunch and enjoy it with all of you. So I'll talk very briefly about a little bit about me, although that was a lovely introduction. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Social Security, which I know some of you have more memories of. And I'll be interested during the Q&A part at the end to hear about your own experiences with it. Talk a little bit about how Social Security works now, and then will it be around in the future? I'll give you a preview, yes. And how will it change? So a little bit about myself. That's me in the middle making matzo balls. I have been a MICA member since 2010. I've been on the MICA House board for about the same amount of time. I was married here at MICA. Spare time, I like cooking, and it seemed appropriate to put a soup making picture up there, given the meal here. And I like getting outside as well. So, talking about Social Security a little bit, when I was doing some research on this, because normally I don't dig too deeply into the history of Social Security, I'm more focused on how it's going to change and how it's doing now. I will say a lot of this came off of Social Security's website, and ssa.gov/history is a treasure trove. They have oral histories and recordings and photographs, and they've really spent a lot of time recording both the Social Security Administration's history and then also how it fits into a larger historic and global perspective about how social insurance has worked around the world. And I think their timeline goes back to about 1600. We're talking about sort of mutual aid, how we can get communities to almost self-insure, to protect the most vulnerable folks or to protect against risks that are unusual but severe. And in the US, I figured I'd start with 1900. Where a lot of this work was happening at the state level, where there was workers' compensation, old age pensions, what they called mother's aid, and some of it for federal workers as well, like workers' comp, retirement, and disability pensions. These were really controversial, and I was surprised when I was reading about it how often courts struck down some of these plans in certain states. The idea of taxing everybody for a social insurance program was really surprising and new and opposed by a lot of people, but not by everybody. And eventually this became more common, at least at the state level. And then there started also to be advocacy for having this at the national level. And I put nice Jewish boy Abraham Epstein up here, whose son, Pierre. So, you know, if you're wondering if your kids or grandkids have done enough for you lately, Pierre wrote a book about his dad called The Forgotten Father of Social Security. And Abraham Epstein founded the American Association for Old Age Security way back in 1927, later renamed American Association for Social Security. And this idea was taking hold. It wasn't just Mr. Epstein, but a lot of folks were interested in this. And FDR was a big proponent of this. And so he said, when he addressed Congress in January 1935, that he'd organized a survey of what had happened in different countries and different states. And he says, the time has come for action by the national government. I shall send to you, meaning Congress, in a few days, definite recommendations based on these studies. These recommendations will cover the broad subjects of unemployment insurance and old age insurance, of benefits for children, for others, for the handicapped. I think that's supposed to be for mothers. For maternity care and for other aspects of dependency and illness where a beginning can now be made. So he was using data and proposing this legislation, and within just a few months, on April 14th, Congress had passed this and he signed the Social Security Act. So it's kind of nice to see how things maybe used to work. It usually takes a lot longer now to get something from a president's idea to an actual law. But this is a picture, and this is actually a composite picture that the Social Security website puts together, because it's actually, most pictures of this are from different angles. You can't see everybody. So they tried to label as many people as they could. There was one woman there, she's number 12, and that's Frances Perkins, who was there.
Secretary of Treasury.
Yes, and so she was Secretary of Labor. And she, most of the other people there are members of Congress, although some are cabinet officials and other folks. And he says, when he signs this act, which didn't just cover what we think of as Social Security now, but also things like unemployment insurance, and what we used to call aid to families with dependent children, now called TANF. It was a really big bill. He says, we can never insure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age. So that's really what he was going for with this. And here are a few folks who were kind of firsts in this. So David John Sweeney Jr. got the first Social Security number, and SSA keeps records of all this stuff. And this happened long enough ago that they don't mind telling certain things like this. Like the lowest Social Security number of all time, they know who got it. They put up her Social Security number. It's 001 000001. It's a lady from Concord, New Hampshire. They have her name on the website. She's long since gone. You can't steal her Social Security number. But so David John Sweeney, I think it's useful to talk about these people because it sort of shows what different people's experiences are even today with Social Security. So he died actually before he ever got benefits, but his wife got survivor benefits for her until her death. So she got 8 years of survivor benefits. Then there's Ernest Ackerman the next year. He worked for 1 day before he retired that was paying into Social Security. So he paid in 5 cents, and he got the first lump sum, which was 17 cents. So he actually made out pretty well. In 1939, it expanded for some more spousal and child benefits of retired and deceased workers. And then in 1940, Ida Mae Fuller was the first person to get a recurring monthly check, and that's a picture of her. She lived to be 100 years old. She made out really well with Social Security. And she paid in $24.75. And then over the course of her life, she got $22,888.92 back. So you can see, Mr. Sweeney paid in and never got anything for himself. Ida Mae Fuller paid in a little, got a lot. That's how insurance works. That's not a bug of Social Security, that's a feature. And to an extent, as much as maybe we'd all like to get more out than we paid in, it can't work that way for everybody. And it's just insurance. I think about it like homeowners insurance. I pay my homeowners insurance every year. I've never made a claim on it, knock on wood. And on the one hand, that's kind of annoying because I keep paying and not getting anything out of it. On the other hand, it means that lightning hasn't struck my house. So it's sort of a similar thing with Social Security, that not everybody's going to get out what they pay in, and that's why it works. So some more expansions. At first, Social Security didn't cover any self-employed people, and it didn't cover any farm or domestic workers, but that changed in 1950. Farm or domestic workers with single employers were covered, and their employers hated this. There was a housewives union that organized to fight against this because they didn't want to pay Social Security for their domestic workers. And some of their workers didn't want to pay into it either. So this sort of was a controversy about who should be covered and who pays in, and is there a right to opt out. Self-employed farmers got coverage in 1954. 1956, disability benefits came in, and that's sort of my area of expertise, and I love talking about disability benefits because I think it's something that when people think about Social Security, they think about retiring in their 60s, but for a lot of people who become unable to work because of a disability before that, the disability benefits are really valuable. 1972 was the first cost of living adjustment. So before that, Congress had to pass a law every time they wanted to do it. And Congress isn't always as effective as they were in 1935 with passing this bill. So it was sort of sporadic and it was complicated. So they just decided, let's just have this happen automatically. And also in 1972, President Nixon signed a bill which established what's called Title 16 of the Social Security Act. This is supplemental security income. And SSI is something else that I'm really interested in. SSI is for people who didn't pay enough into Social Security to become insured, or are insured for a very small amount of money. And I'll talk a little bit about how people get insured later on. And so it can top them up. SSI, babies can get SSI if they're in low-income families with low resources and they're disabled. There are people who are over 100 years old who get SSI because at age 65, it's an age-based program. So SSI is a really wide-range program, and it really helps people who have very low incomes and assets. And a lot of people get both SSI and what we think of as a more standard Social Security benefit, either retirement, survivors, or disability insurance. So that leads into Social Security today. So Title II is what we think of, I think, usually when people think about Social Security. And it's sometimes called Retirement Survivors and Disability Insurance, RSDI. So you can get it based on age. And I think probably a lot of people in here know about this, that you can claim it as early as 62 or as late as 70. The full retirement age is gradually going up. It used to be 65. It's moving slowly up to 67. So if you were born, I think it's between 1943 and 1954, your full retirement age is 66. But you can claim it earlier or later. It's just that you get more if you wait. And every month you wait, you get more, which is probably not a secret to folks in this room. The reason they do that is to try and equalize it across the population so that over the course of a lifespan, everybody gets the same amount, is the idea. That if you start at age 70, you get more each month because you'll get it for fewer months. Of course, some people are like Ida Mae Fuller and they live to 100, and some people are not. So there's a little bit of guesswork in it. Social Security's chief actuary says, I can tell you exactly when you should claim. All I need to know is your earnings history, whether you're married, your spouse's earnings history, and the date each of you will pass away. So, there's some guesswork involved. You can also get Title II coverage if you're insured, if you have a disability, and I'll talk a little bit about how Social Security defines disability later on. You can also get it based on the earnings record of somebody you depend on. This is often a spouse's record. So often, for example, there might be a married couple where one stayed home to raise a family and one worked. When the breadwinner passes away, the surviving spouse can get benefits on the breadwinner's record, even if the stay-at-home spouse didn't pay into the system. So that can happen when someone's disabled, deceased, or retired. It can be a spouse, it can be a child. There are certain situations where it can even be a parent or a grandparent. And I think about this when I talk about children. I call it the Barron Trump rule. So President Trump has a young son. He's 12 years old. President Trump is about 72. I don't know if he's paid into Social Security or is claiming Social Security, but if he did, his son would be getting benefits as the dependent of a retired worker. And so you can think about people being able to get benefits on someone else's record for Title II. Title 16 SSI is different. The age rule is 65. There's no benefit to waiting, and you can't get it earlier. Based on age, it's just 65. Based on disability, at any age, like I said, baby on up, as long as the income, asset, and the other rules are met. And you can't get it on somebody else's record because it's not based on somebody's earning history. It's based on someone's need. So that's why I just wrote no there. And like I said, some people can get both. You can imagine somebody who paid in a little bit to the system and is 65 years old. They might get a little of their money from Title II and a little bit from Title 16. So, what do I mean by disability benefits? The good news is it's the same for each program. For SSI and SSDI, they have the same definition. And it's based on, for adults, the ability to work. So the first thing that they look at is a person performing what they call substantial gainful activity? Are they earning enough? It doesn't matter how sick you are, if you're earning over about, it changes year to year, but about $1,100 a month, and it's different for blind versus non-blind, you can't get benefits. Because Title II benefits and the Social Security program is based on helping people replace their income when they're not able to work. So if you're able to work, disability benefits, not for you. Assuming that a person is working below that level, the next thing they look at is, does somebody have a severe impairment, or more than one? And all they mean by severe is a more than minimal limitation in activities of daily living. So for most people who've taken the trouble to apply for these benefits, they have a severe impairment. Then they have listings, that's step 3. And what that is for certain disabilities, for certain types of cancers, for diabetes, for certain back problems, for schizophrenia, for Down syndrome, for all these different things, they have a list. It's in Social Security's regulations. And if you meet it, the decision ends there, you get benefits. Let's say you don't though, or let's say you have a condition that doesn't have a listing. So for example, migraine headaches don't have a listing. But migraine headaches can be devastating. They could certainly keep somebody out of the workforce. Or maybe you have a combination of things, and maybe you have a back problem and COPD and depression and a foot problem. Maybe none of the things together keep you out of the workforce, but as a combination, they might. In that situation, Social Security looks at what you can do, both physically and mentally, and they check to see, can you go back to a job you've done in the past 15 years? And if you can, they say, well, go back to it, and they don't give you disability benefits. But for a lot of people, they can't go back to the jobs they used to do. Their health has gotten worse, or the job doesn't exist anymore, or the job has changed a lot in a way that they can't do it. So then they say, is there anything else you could do sort of at the full-time substantial gainful activity level? And if they think yes, then they say, well, go do it. And if they say, no, there's really nothing you can do full-time given your health, then you get the benefits. So this is a strict standard. The only OECD, so the only developed country that has a stricter standard is South Korea. And in the US, fewer than 4 in 10 applications result in an award, even after all the stages of appeal. And there's a lot of stages of appeal. You can go to administrative law judge, you can go to what Social Security calls the Appeals Council, you can go to federal court, you can go all the way up. The Supreme Court generally doesn't take this level of case, but definitely circuit courts every year take cases with people applying for disability benefits. There's a different process for kids, you might expect that. The standard's different for kids, because kids are just terrible workers in general. So if they did it based on, is this child able to perform substantial gainful activity? Like every 2-year-old would get benefits. They're horrible employees. So with kids, what they do is they compare them to other kids of their age. But it's still a strict standard, and most kids who apply are not approved. So how do you get insured for benefits? Most people in this room, I'm guessing, are insured. They paid FICA taxes through the years to cover them for both Social Security and Medicare. The Social Security portion is currently 6.2% from employer and 6.2% from the employee. You have to pay both sides of it if you're self-employed, up to a cap. This cap that I put here, that is the 2019 cap. So if you earn more than $132,900 a year, you don't have to pay on that additional level. So for example, there are millionaires who stop paying their Social Security tax in January. But more than 90% of people pay it on their whole income. Most people don't earn more than that. You have to earn enough qualifying credits to be insured. And to buy a credit in 2019, to earn a credit, involves earning $1,360. You need at least 1 credit for every calendar year after you turn 21. So between the year you turn 21 and when you turn 62, or the year before you die, or the year you become disabled. So if you got 40 of these credits, you're insured, you're permanently insured. So if you worked for 10 years at the qualifying credit level for those years, you're 4 credits a year, you're done. You're gonna get your retirement benefits, your spouse or your dependents are gonna get your survivor benefits. For disability benefits, there's also a recency requirement. You have to be fully insured and you have to have earned 20 qualifying credits in the past 10 years. We usually say 5 of the past 10 years. So you can lose your insured status. And I use my mom as an example for this. My mom worked, but then she stayed home to raise kids, and she went back a little bit, but then she retired when my parents moved down here. And as a result, if she became disabled at this point, she would not get disability benefits because she's lost her insured status. But when she's ready to retire, she's permanently insured for that. She'll be able to get her retirement benefits. And people talk about this as an entitlement, and some people call that a dirty, they feel like that's a dirty word. They don't like to talk about entitlements. All that entitlement means here is just, if you're insured, you're gonna get it. The government can't run out of money for it, and we'll talk a little bit more about trust funds in a bit, but you're entitled to this money. You've paid in, you're insured, you're gonna get it. There's no wait list for Social Security, and that's all that people mean when they talk about that. The formula is complicated. I'm not necessarily gonna go into it. For SSI, the maximum that somebody can get is $771 a month. Somebody who's insured for both, who's getting both, they're insured for SSDI or for another Social Security benefit, but not for very much, and they get topped up with SSI, they'll get $791. So it's not a lot, and it's below the poverty line. And so, if people can get insured, that's better. The formula for what somebody gets, they look at up to the highest 35 years of earnings, they modify it for inflation, and then they use this formula that has what's called bend points. They're almost like brackets, the same way that tax brackets exist. And the reason they do that is it's a little bit like means testing. It means that people who've been on the lower end of the earning spectrum through their working years have a higher amount of their earnings replaced by Social Security than somebody who's been very wealthy and who's earned a lot over their lifetime. With the idea being that somebody who's earned a lot probably also has had the opportunity to save a lot and may not need quite as much Social Security. The maximum that somebody can get is, for 2019, is if they retired at age 70, $3,770 a month, which is kind of a lot of money. The average is nowhere near that. The average retired worker gets $1,419 a month, and disabled workers are a couple $100s less. And there's a lot of complicated stuff about family maximums, how much everybody can get off of one worker's record, how they just for early and late retirement. It's complicated. Almost 68 million people get Social Security benefits at this point. It's a big portion of America that's receiving some kind of benefit. And the majority of them are people who are getting Social Security retirement benefits. They paid into the system and they've elected to take their retirement benefits. That's more than 45 million of them. But Social Security publishes data on how many get other types of benefits as well. And Social Security is the nation's largest anti-poverty program. So in DC, and this is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, they put this out, the elderly poverty rate, if it weren't for Social Security, would be more than a third, 34.4%. It's still pretty high. 15.5% of seniors in the district live under the poverty line, but it would be a lot worse without Social Security. And it's not just seniors who benefit from it. So with children, there's more than 1 million children who are lifted above the poverty line by Social Security nationwide. Some of them because they're living with grandparents, and their grandparents are getting benefits, and that's helping their household. Some of them are getting benefits themselves, either because a parent passed away and they're getting survivor benefits. This is what I call the Paul Ryan rule, now soon to be former Representative Paul Ryan lost his dad at a young age and grew up being supported in part by Social Security benefits. There's also children with disabilities who get SSI, and this can raise their families out of poverty as well. So it makes a big difference. There's about 22 million people across the country who would be in poverty if it weren't for Social Security, who aren't. So I think it's a pretty amazing program. Briefly, the interactions between Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Medicare has a separate insured status. You pay into it separately through a different part of the FICA tax. You get it at age 65. Or people who are getting Social Security disability insurance can get it 29 months after they are found to have become disabled. So if Social Security says that you became disabled on January 1st, 2019, it's gonna be 29 more months before you can get your Medicare. And the reason they do that, honestly, is because it saves money. It's because insuring people sooner would cost a lot of money, and some people die before they get it, and some people they don't have to pay premiums and cover them for an extra 2.5 years almost. They'll say it's because they want to check and see if people are really disabled or if they're going back to work. But it's pretty hard to get on these benefits, and most people who get disability benefits wind up not going back to work. About 1 in 5 men and 1 in 6 women die within the first 5 years of getting SSDI. So most folks aren't going back, and most folks who get SSDI are older. They're in their 50s or 60s. Medicaid, totally separate, varies by state. In some states, getting SSI is a way to get Medicaid. Here in the district, we don't need that. We've expanded Medicaid. If you're low enough income, you get Medicaid whether you're disabled or not. But in some states, including Virginia still now, but it will change soon. In Virginia, getting SSI can be really important to people, both because it puts money in their pockets each month, but because it qualifies them for health insurance, which for some people is really the most valuable part, especially because Medicaid covers, for people with disabilities, a lot of personal care assistance that Medicare does not. Some of you may be familiar with this. So if you, for example, are somebody with muscular dystrophy and you need an assistant to help you get out of bed in the morning, brush your teeth, get dressed, leave the house, having Medicaid is incredibly valuable. So I don't like to talk about Social Security fraud because it's really uncommon and it can distract, but I think it's worth mentioning. Are you familiar with the Ivory soap commercial where they say 99 and 44 100% pure? Social Security is cleaner than soap. The Retirement Survivor and Disability Program's payment accuracy every year that the Government Accountability Office has tracked it is more than 99.44%. They get it right a lot of the time. And when they get it wrong, it's about evenly split between it being Social Security's fault and somebody not reporting something, and it's about evenly split between people getting too much and too little. And very little of it is fraud. More commonly, it's something like a check goes out to a retiree, and then the following week, Social Security learns that that person died. That payment, that last payment, was an overpayment, and Social Security is actually really good about taking that money back. I know this because when my grandmother passed away, she died in Florida right before a hurricane was coming. I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to call Social Security and deal with this. Nope, within like a week, the money was back out of her account. They knew real fast. So, that's an improper payment, but nobody was committing fraud. SSI has a little bit lower payment accuracy. It's a smaller program, the dollar amounts are lower. The rules are really complicated for SSI. So for example, if you're in the hospital for a full calendar month, generally you're not entitled to SSI for that month. If you're in jail for the full calendar month, if you're out of the country, which includes going, by the way, to Puerto Rico or Guam, but not the Northern Mariana Islands, weirdly, you don't qualify for SSI for that month. So you can imagine that there's a lot of things. If your living situation changes, if all of a sudden you're getting free rent because you moved in with your cousin, your SSI entitlement changes. Any sort of income, including getting discounted food or shelter, can affect your SSI. So people's SSI bounces around a lot. Your retirement benefits pretty much stay the same. And so SSI has a little bit lower program accuracy, but still very good. And when there's a mistake, it tends to be either because Social Security is delayed in doing something or because somebody didn't understand the rules. Very rarely is there fraud. But when it happens, it's kind of exciting and Social Security likes to talk about it. Everyone likes to talk about, man says he's blind, actually drives race car. That's exciting. Like, I would stay up to watch that on the news, but people don't talk as much about the normal stuff that happens with Social Security. Like, man gets cancer, doesn't have to be homeless because he gets disability benefits. I might be like, I'm going to bed, I'm not gonna watch that. So the fraud's fun to talk about. They like to come and Office of the Inspector General will come and show you, all his cool crime-fighting stuff. It's actually now a female acting Inspector General. I'm sure she'd come and show you all of her cool crime-fighting stuff, but that's really not a big part of Social Security. Okay, so how are the revenues stored and have they been looted? I think this is a question that people ask. So these are two lockboxes. One's a lot bigger than the other, and that reflects the fact that Social Security has two trust funds, a smaller one for disability insurance and a big one for retirement and survivor's insurance. And occasionally people in Congress suggest maybe we should just merge them, and my organization actually supports that. It does make a lot of sense, but they're separate. Have they been looted? No. Have they been invested? Yes. Are they invested in the stock market? No. And frankly, this year, that's probably a good thing. They're invested in a special kind of savings bond that you can't go out and buy. It's only for Social Security to buy. And they do that kind of as a hedge against inflation. It's a way of making a little bit of money, but the government's going to pay it back. And it means that the government doesn't have to borrow money from private people or from other countries. They can use it from the Social Security. Some people get really worried about this. I have to say, I'm not very worried about this. Like, if we get to a point where the government's not paying this back, there are so many other things that are going to be so horrible and broken in this country that Social Security is not even going to be like high on the list. They pay it back. They've never missed a payment. That's not to say that some people haven't had individual problems with their checks, because goodness knows that happens. And they can be difficult to deal with, but the government's not stealing the money out of Social Security. If I can leave you with one thing, try not to worry about that. So Social Security today, one headquarters in Woodlawn, Maryland. It's outside of Baltimore. It's really a kind of pain to get to. And there's an acting commissioner of Social Security now. There's been an acting commissioner of Social Security since 2013. There hasn't been a Senate confirmed one. We're really close though. President Trump nominated someone. His name is Andrew Saul. If any of you are familiar with the Cachet clothing store, Andrew Saul used to run Cachet. He sold his business has mostly been ladies' clothing, and he went to business school with President Trump. He also worked for the thrift. If any of you are former federal employees, he worked with the thrift with the TSP. And so he has some experience with retirement, but he's not a Social Security expert, but he has run a business. And I went to his confirmation hearing. It definitely could have been worse, but he's not an expert, but it looks like he will probably be confirmed. And to some extent, it will be good to have a confirmed person. We'll see who gets to talk with him first and what ideas he gets into his head to see whether it turns out well or not. But he'll work up in Woodlawn, Maryland. There's 10 regional offices. The DC area is served by the Philadelphia one. There's 1,245 field offices across the country. There's payment service centers, card centers, data centers. Social Security is big. There's more than 61,000 Social Security Administration employees across the country. There's also people in embassies who work on this outside of the country. For example, if you have a problem in Latin America, if you're an expat and you're having problems with Social Security, San Jose, Costa Rica is where you go. There's also 13,000 state employees who are paid by Social Security to make disability determinations. So it's big. It costs more than $12.7 billion to run the program this fiscal year, but that reflects less than 1% of the benefits paid out, which if any of you have experience with private insurance, it's a really good ratio. Most companies have a higher overhead than that. And if you've ever tried to call Social Security, you know that actually they could use a little bit more administrative money because you're going to be on hold for a while, or if you've tried to go into the office. Or if you're from Arlington and you don't have an office anymore in your neighborhood because they closed it. And I see someone here who is in the photos protesting that. This is a challenge. DC used to have 4 offices, now they have 2. Now they have 3. And they're getting a lot of folks from Arlington. So it's running lean. Some would say too lean. But just to show you, this is an enormous program. If $12.7 billion is less than 1%, it's a lot of people benefiting from this. Okay, so does Social Security affect the budget deficit? What do people think?
No.
No.
answer. No, it doesn't, because the money's in those trust funds. The money's separate. SSI is a little bit different. SSI is paid out of general revenue. But no, Social Security doesn't affect it because its money comes out of the trust funds. Sometimes people will say that, look, if Social Security runs out of money, then the government's going to lend them money. That's never happened. What's always happened is that the Social Security taxes have changed in order to balance the books. So, no, it does not affect the budget deficit. Many other things do, and the budget deficits are large, but it's not Social Security's fault, and it's actually not Medicare's fault either. So how much is in the trust funds now? We often hear about like these trust funds are running out of money, this is really bad. There's almost $3 trillion in there right now. And that money gets replenished every year both by things being paid into it, so Social Security taxes, a little bit from taxation of Social Security benefits, and a little bit from interest on those savings bonds that I was talking about. So are they going bankrupt? No. To me, bankrupt means there's no money in there. They're definitely not going to be there, and they're not going to be there in the next 75 years, which is how long the actuary estimates for. But they are going to become insolvent around 2034. And the chief actuary is pretty good at these estimates, so we'll go with 2034. Meaning that at that point, there won't be enough money to pay out what they're expected to need to pay out. We've come to the point where more money has started to go out than more money than is coming in, but there's already a lot in there. So, but by 2034, something needs to change. And that change could be that Social Security decreases or that money goes in. I will say for the Disability Trust Fund, at this point, when it becomes insolvent, which for the DI Trust Fund is 2032, it can still pay about 96% of scheduled benefits. So it's not good. Nobody wants to have their benefits cut by 4%, but it's also, it could be much bigger. It could be much worse. So why is this happening? Well, the population's getting older. More people are claiming Social Security benefits. I think I saw the statistic that 10,000 people retire every day. So it's a lot, and if you're taking those retirement claims, you're busy right now. The birth rate has gone down a lot. There's less immigration, and immigrants help Social Security, both what they call legal and other than legal is Social Security's term. In fact, in some ways, other than legal help more because they tend to pay Social Security taxes and they can't get any money out. And there's low interest rates, so those savings bonds aren't getting as much money as they used to. On the other hand, this one's a little bit dismal, but extending the trust fund solvency, you've probably read about how life expectancy is not improving the way that it used to. There's a lot of people who are passing away early through things that they call diseases of despair, like addiction and suicide. That is awful, but not if you're the chief actuary of Social Security. And he's like the nicest guy in the federal government. He always brings chocolate to events, and he's like the Mr. Rogers of the federal workforce. But he'll get out there and he'll be like, guys, this is bad, but it's good for us. And so, it does change the trust fund. More people working helps. And then also decreasing disability applications and awards. They've decreased in large part just because of demographic factors and because the economy is good, but there's probably other factors that are going into it. And this one is probably the one where the chief actuary is the most flummoxed. He keeps thinking, okay, there's gonna be some more disability applications soon, and it keeps on not happening. It keeps on being below his estimates, which is good for the trust fund, but sort of confusing and maybe problematic if there's people with disabilities who aren't applying or aren't getting the benefits that they need. So what can we do? It's actually really simple. It's just like balancing your household budget. You can spend less, take in more, or do a little bit of both. How do you spend less? Well, you cut benefits. That tends to be really unpopular. Politicians don't really like doing that. Nobody wants to get up on stage and be like, Grandma, you gotta cut back. No one's gonna say that. So what they tend to do is they say, millennials, you're gonna have to cut back. That might work. They could raise the retirement age. This is a cut because people will get less benefits over the course of their life. It also puts more pressure on the disability program. And we've already seen this with raising the retirement age from 65 to 66. More than 5% of the people who get Social Security disability benefits right now are 65 years old. They're people who would have gotten retirement benefits if the retirement age hadn't gone up. So that's a challenge, and it's more expensive and more difficult for Social Security to do a disability claim than a retirement claim. But you could raise the retirement age. You could raise the requirements for insured status so that people have to work longer or earn more or pay more into the system. You could means test it so that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett don't get Social Security anymore. On the one hand, that's really appealing because they clearly don't need this money. On the other hand, when you take the program from being universal to being a program for lower income people, it really cuts into its support. There's a saying in policy that programs for poor people get poor support, and that is a challenge with making it a non-universal program. But you could change the bend points. You could make it a little bit more means tested, a little bit friendlier to lower income people, and a little bit less friendly to higher income people. And you could do that in a way that could save some money. You could also limit disability benefits. You could cut them off after a few years. You could do a lot of things to Social Security disability benefits that would make it harder for people to get them or harder for people to stay on them. That would save money. It might also hurt people with disabilities, though. You could also raise some revenue. You could increase the tax rate above 6.2%. You could make higher earners pay in more. The amount that you get out of that depends on whether those higher earners are also going to get more out of it and how much more. You could do it through brackets so that it's not a set thing. There's a lot of ways to play around with those levers. You could tax things other than wages, like stock options, capital gains. You could add a special estate tax that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. You could also invest the trust funds differently. For many years, people looked at the stock market and said, well, if we put our Social Security money in there, we would have done better. But not every year. So that's a riskier one. But these are some things that people talk about when they talk about how they might get more money into the trust funds. I will also add to this, you could legalize more immigrants. If you had more people paying into the system, you could bring in more immigrants to the country, which is similar from an actuarial standpoint to having more babies. You could encourage people to have more babies. Eventually that does raise revenue. Kids are a cost for a while, but eventually they start to pay off. So what's the mix that Americans like? In October 2014, the National Academy of Social Insurance did a study. They called it Americans Make Hard Choices. And they went out to groups like this one, all over the country, different age groups, different political orientations, and they taught them about a variety of different options and what they would do to trust fund solvency. And they developed this package that most people liked. And what it would do is eliminate that tax maximum so that all wage income was covered. It would raise the FICA tax. It would switch to a different cost of living that tends to be a slightly higher cost of living adjustment each year. It's based on the bundle of goods that older people tend to use, so it weights, for example, gasoline less and healthcare more. And so it tends to be a better fit for what people on Social Security are actually spending. And they also supported raising the minimum benefit so that people who pay in for 30 years can retire above the poverty line even if they retire early at 62. And most people liked that. So overall, in this, I know these numbers are small, 76% of people got behind that plan. And it was more than 70% of every generation, every family income, and every party affiliation liked it. It's not perfect, but it's something that people could get behind. Do I think that this is what Congress is going to come up with at some point? No, it'll probably be some different package. We'll probably have some cuts and some expansion and some revenue and some savings. But you can see that it is possible to come up with a plan that gets Social Security long-term solvency and actually allows for the expansion of it in terms of bigger cost of living adjustments and help for lower wage earners. It's doable. This is not impossible. This is not like a math difficult problem. This is a politics difficult problem. And so we can do this. Other expansion ideas that people talk about. Credit for people who've been out of the workforce for caregiving, either for a family member with an illness or for a child. Folks in that situation often are not insured on their own record, or they end up getting less because they've been out of the workforce, so crediting that. Ending the wait, there's currently a 5-month wait after someone becomes disabled for them to start getting disability benefits, and this 29-month wait I talked about for Medicare. It could increase and inflation adjust SSI. Some of the things, I always go back to the year that some things in SSI were set as a dollar amount was the same year that my dad had his bar mitzvah. So for example, the $65 earned income disregard, that was a lot more in the 70s than it's worth now. The $2,000 asset limit with SSI. If you have more than $2,000 of countable assets, you can't get SSI. $2,000 when that number was set is like $12,000 now, but it didn't get adjusted. And for the former state, federal employees in the room, you may be familiar with the WEP, which is the windfall elimination provision, or the GPO, the government pension offset. These are things that if you worked in both the private sector and the public sector, or if you had a spouse that worked in one and you worked in the other, it can reduce your household benefits. Very unpopular among retirees who worked in the government, including my father-in-law who spent his career at the Postal Service and is really mad that he can't get retirement benefits off of my mother-in-law's account. He says, it would have been better if I just stayed home. It's like, well, no, because you get a Postal Service pension and, you also got money all those years. So no, it wasn't really better, but there's a lot of people who feel like it would be better to do it a different way. And for a lot of them, yeah, there are changes that could be made that would benefit them. So there's a lot of different changes that could be made. They take money, but it's possible to get that money. So I'll leave you with this. I think Social Security is an amazing thing that America did. Did it in 1935. It hasn't always been the same. It's never going to be the same. It's not a static program, but it's a program that helps a lot of people. And there's a lot of ways to change it, some good, some bad, and which ones you think are good or bad is going to depend on your own opinion. But you can talk about this, and you can tell people how you think it should be changed. And oftentimes, it is grassroots people who have been really important in either making the changes they want or preventing changes they don't want. So you all have some ability there as well, even if, like me, you live in DC and you don't have a voting member of Congress.
Stacy, many people have questions, but before we begin that session, please don't clear the tables until we're completely through with the program. When you get the mic from me, put it on your chin. That assures that you're in the right position. And finally, there may be another phone or two hiding in a purse. Check, make sure they're all off. So, identify the next question.
Let's start there.
My chin, huh? Okay, I'm in position. While I was listening to you, I started thinking about the number of young workers who work in the gig economy or who are not in a tax economy. And I know the IRS is the IRS. I really don't know how they pursue or enforce against people who have no property. But where is that putting Social Security?
So that's a good question. So the question was people who work in the gig economy. So for a lot of them, they are actually going to be responsible for paying both halves of these Social Security taxes, which can be really disappointing to people. I'm a volunteer tax preparer, and we just did a whole session on the gig economy, and a lot of people who drive for Uber or for Lyft or do similar things are really disappointed at the end of the year when they realize how much money of their earnings has gone into this. There probably are people who aren't paying it, and that can definitely affect Social Security. And there definitely are people who I think are going to have an unpleasant surprise later in life when they didn't pay it and then find out that they're not insured. I think we have a follow-up, so let's get the microphone for that.
Oh, I'm sorry, this is a follow-up. How do you enforce payment? You're a volunteer tax preparer. I might be a babysitter and not have income through Uber or some corporate entity where you could track me down. So I just wonder, is there an enforcement I realize you don't pay, you don't get.
Right. No, I
But,
think it's a good question. So what happens if you don't pay in, if you're working under the table and you don't pay in? So Social Security's, I will say, it is sometimes hard for them to find this. I think what ends up happening for a lot of people is that they go to apply, or they look at their Social Security statement and realize that earnings aren't reflected on there, and they can correct that for a certain amount of time. But I think really the enforcement mechanism is that they don't pay and then they don't get. I think it's probably not Social Security's biggest enforcement priority to find the people who aren't paying in. But it's a really good point, and it's something that could hurt the trust fund if it becomes a bigger issue. Oh, microphone.
Thank you.
My husband was born in 1921. Do you know about the Notch Group?
I know a little bit about the Notch Group, and I know that every year there's a representative named Grace Meng from New York who introduces a bill called the Notch Fairness Act. There's a small group of people called Notch babies who, in some ways, were disadvantaged by when their working years coincided with when certain things happened in the Social Security legislation. It is an issue. I'm not sure that it's going to get fixed anytime soon. She never gets any attention on her bill.
My understanding of it was that in that Roosevelt, the benefits have been reduced, I think, by a third. For people born in maybe it was something 3 years, I was surrounding 1921 or beginning then, and probably affects some people in this room where your benefits, I think, were cut a third in order to not bankrupt Social Security, and it was during Roosevelt, I understand, was the one who implemented it.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and I won't pretend to be an expert on Notch babies. It's a problem that people have been aware of at this point for many decades and many generations. At this point, I think a major challenge with fixing it is that many of the Notch babies have passed away. And so what that means is that it's cheaper to fix the problem now, but it even feels more unfair to fix it now because only some people who were affected would be fixed. And there's less political pressure to fix it because there's fewer people who are affected by it. So I will say I'm not optimistic about a change to the Notch system. It's a complicated thing where people paid in less so they got less, but some people feel like it wasn't fair, that they didn't get exactly what they should have. So, yeah, okay. I can do right next to you.
Sorry. Yes.
I just wanted to know what you do about reassigning numbers if somebody dies.
Oh, that's a good question. So Social Security thus far has not had to reassign any numbers. It is eventually going to become an issue. They will run out of numbers eventually. And at that point, there's sort of a question as to will they just add on a 10th digit? That's one. Will they add another digit to it so that they won't have to reassign? Or will they reassign? But thankfully, they haven't come up to that point yet. So no, your Social Security number shouldn't be anybody else's. There are occasionally some weird things that happen. They call it scrambled earnings, where they might put your earnings on someone else's record, or someone else's earnings might show up on your record. It gets really complicated, but nobody should have been assigned the same number as anybody else. I won't say it never happens, but it shouldn't have to happen. And behind you, there's another question.
Okay, I hadn't thought of this question until Barbara asked her question, but Social Security number has sort of become like our national universal ID, and identity theft has become a really big problem in this country. People get a hold of your Social Security number. So can you talk about what's being done about that?
Sure, so it is a huge problem. There have actually been several hearings in Congress about this, because when somebody's Social Security number is taken, it's sort of a problem because financial institutions have used that number. If all that your Social Security number were good for was your Social Security benefit, it really wouldn't be a huge deal if other people had your Social Security number, which is why, for example, Medicare cards used to have your Social Security number on them, and it's only very, very recently that you've got a new Medicare card that don't have your SSNs on them. I think that Congress is a little bit flummoxed about what to do, because if it were something that they could make Social Security do, they would do it. But they have to make credit card companies and banks do something, which essentially is make them not use the Social Security number. And Congress is generally pretty hesitant to make banks and credit card companies do stuff. So at this point, there hasn't really been legislation that would protect it. But I agree that your Social Security number is a really valuable commodity at this point, and I will say SSA tells you don't keep your Social Security card in your wallet, don't laminate it, just leave it at home, because you don't really want people to have that information about you, and yet until recently it was on everybody's Medicare card. Yeah.
Should somebody who's already retired and receiving Social Security but who's working, should they be paying into it?
So I will tell you, I am not an expert on how this works. People who have hit retirement age and who claim their benefits and then work have a very different set of rules. Some of it depends on how much they are earning through their work. Some people end up doing what they call suspending their benefits and then coming back to them at a higher level. It is complicated. I will tell you that SSA's website has some very good retirement calculators on it, and there are also financial planners who can get special certifications in Social Security claiming strategies. I wouldn't want to give any wrong advice, so I would say use those two resources to figure out if what's going on with your Social Security is correct. Okay, sir?
I think this is somewhat moot, but my recollection, what's really clouded my view of Social Security is that during wartime and say the Vietnam War and other periods of budget deficit, the government did dip into Social Security, and I don't know what the answer is, whether that they introduced the use of bonds to have future repayment or whatever, but am I incorrect in thinking that yes, things have happened to the Social Security?
So there have been situations where there were special bonds issued, but in general, there's never been a situation where the government has taken money out and reneged on an agreement to pay it back. Whatever the terms of those bonds were, and some of them may have been, we'll pay it back in 1 year, and some of them may have been, we'll pay it back in 10 years, but they've paid them back. And there are different interest rates at different points, but they've paid them back. There have also been a few situations where money has been reallocated from one of the trust funds to another trust fund. This came up in 2014 and 2015 when the Disability Insurance Trust Fund was running out of money a lot faster than the retirement one. And so some of the tax revenues were reallocated for a couple of years to put more money into disability. This is another reason why some people in Congress support just making them one trust fund. When you're paying into the system, you don't know whether you're going to end up getting retirement, survivor, or disability insurance. So may as well just throw it all into the same bucket, some would say. Others like to be able to keep the record separate. So sometimes there is a movement from one trust fund to the other. In terms of what happened during Vietnam, I will say I'm not sure, but I can say that there's never been a time that money has been taken out and not repaid on schedule. Yeah, Sid's got a question.
Is it fair to say, using the lock boxes, that one of those is empty of cash and instead is full of IOUs? Could you use the metaphor?
So I don't like to say IOUs, but yeah, I mean, it's full of savings bonds. The same way that some of your retirement accounts are full of either U.S. savings bonds or foreign bonds or corporate bonds. They're there in a way that I think helps Social Security because income is coming in through interest on those bonds. It's better than just leaving the money under the mattress, as it were. And it's also better for the U.S. as a whole rather than borrowing money from elsewhere. If we're not going to have a balanced budget, better to have bonds that are coming from the trust fund than bonds coming from foreign investors or from individual investors. But yeah, I think you can say that in that lockbox is a mix of cash and savings bonds. And one lockbox is for disability insurance and one is for retirement and survivor insurance, and that one's the much bigger lockbox.
In that connection, could you just say whether in the past the box really did just have cash and there was no investment whatsoever?
I think there probably probably was a point where they didn't use the special bonds, probably right at first. I'm not sure when that switched over, but I don't think that it's ever been anything other than bonds. Like, they never invested in the stock market with the money, for example. Okay, yes. Sarah in the apron.
So, as a follow-up to that, what is it that prevents Social Security from being invested in more ambitious and greater revenue-producing instruments other than T-bills or savings bonds or what have you? I know that when conservatives propose privatizing Social Security, they say people can get more of a return on their money. What prevents Social Security trust fund governors from getting more of a return on their money?
So, politics. Right now, the law says that they can't be invested. That could change. So George W. Bush, for example, supported a partial privatization. There are potential benefits to that. Sometimes there are stock returns that are higher. There are potential risks to that. In some years, the stock market decreases, and sometimes a lot. I will also say there are costs that go along with that. So, like, my dad's job is he invests pension funds, mostly municipal pension funds. And he is paid pretty well for his expertise and for picking the right stocks and the right investments. Presumably, if we had a trust fund invested, we would need to hire some pretty smart people to figure out how to invest the money well. And some years they'd have better years than others, but they'd expect to be paid in all the years. So there'd be some costs involved with that. I will also say, because Social Security is so big, investing even a little bit of it, so even a little bit of that $2.9 trillion that's currently in the trust funds, could have a really big effect on the financial markets. And what would it do if you took, let's say, a third of it, you took $1 trillion and you decided to buy some stocks with it? Well, first of all, how would you pick those stocks? And you're really giving those stocks a big boost. You know, do you like GM? Are you not friends with GM this week? Did GM just open a plant, close a plant? You know, what sort of GM's lobbyists are going to be down there, I'm sure, asking for some of that money. But what about Amazon? You know, what about any number of companies? And so the amount of money that's there certainly would have the potential to make a pretty big change to our financial markets in a way that I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand, but seems to me like it would be pretty big. So there are certainly risks with doing it, but yes, also the potential for greater returns. I think at this point they've chosen stability. And so far that's worked out, but maybe Congress will decide to go on a different path at some point. Nancy's got a question.
So speaking of Congress, who all do you see or foresee is going to kind of lead the battle here for any kind of change? It sounds like, you know, things have to be done sooner than later.
Yeah, so Social Security Chief Actuary will always say that he is neutral on what changes get made. He has to be, that's his job. He just scores them. He doesn't tell you which ones he likes. But he says, and he's right, that the sooner you make the changes, the more modest those changes are, the longer you have to phase them in. So yes, something, if it's not done soon, will have to be more extreme in 2033 than it is in, let's say, 2023. The new chair of the House Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee is John Larson. He is from Connecticut, and he has a bill called the Social Security 2100 Act, which would get to 75-year solvency. His predecessor as chair was Sam Johnson of Texas, who just retired at the end, well, will be retiring at the end of this Congress. Korean War veteran, also very interested in Social Security. He also had a bill that would get to 75-year solvency. They have totally different approaches. One of them does it fully through revenue increases. One does it completely through cuts. Do I think that either of them is going to get through Congress in the next 2 years? No. And I, certainly for the one that's all cuts, it actually would be worse than just letting the trust funds exhaust. It cuts it deeper than not touching the trust funds at all. So I think that that one faces some pretty stiff political headwinds. And also Mr. Johnson is now retiring, so that bill would have to find a new sponsor. They are sort of two people who've been very interested in it. I don't know who the new ranking member of that subcommittee will be. That's the Republican who will come in as the ranking member on that subcommittee. In the Senate, Orrin Hatch has been the head of the Finance Committee. He is also leaving. I don't know who the chair or the ranking member of the Finance Committee will be. The ranking member in the past has been Senator Wyden, who is very interested in aging issues and will proudly tell you at every opportunity that he was a member of the Grey Panthers. He is very interested in aging issues. So I don't know if there will be any changes to Social Security in the next Congress. I think it's always hard when we're heading to a presidential election year. People who are in Congress but running for president are sometimes a little hesitant to do things and make tough choices because they know that with Social Security, somebody's going to be upset by any sort of change, and people are upset by leaving it alone. So they just kind of try to forget about it for a couple of years. But the problem is we have elections every 4 years, so they can't forget about it all the time. So far they have. But so eventually, yes, something will change. I just hope it's not in 2033.
I think we have time for one more question. Somebody who hasn't asked one?
I think I have an important question. Everyone always says, oh, I think I have an important question. Actually, I don't know how to formulate the question here, but I had an unusual Social Security experience. One day, they gave me $25,000 out of the blue. And so I called them to find out what was going on, and of course they didn't know. And nobody at Social Security could tell me what to do. I figured I ought not to spend the money. I finally just sent them a check for that amount of money. And that caused a great deal of confusion, which caused Social Security to decide to review my whole account. And it turned out that because I retired in the middle of a year, but I had paid more Social Security, the cat business, so I got that $25,000 back. But the thing is, how do people protect themselves? How do you know
That is a really good question.
how much money you're entitled to and whether your account is straight?
Right. So that is a good question. How do you know if you're getting the right amount? I will say Social Security has some really good calculators on their website. That is useful. You can put in a lot of information from your earnings record and get a sense of what you should be getting. Most people who have problems with Social Security, it's not that they get a random check for $25,000 out of the blue. I regret to inform you. Although when I was representing people, I did have 2 times where I was paid a representative fee even though I had waived it. And actually, you're right, it is a pain to give money back to them. And I had to, and you had to make sure you were doing it right because you get your 1099 at the end of the year from Social Security and you want it to say the right thing and you want to be paying the right taxes. So I guess I'll broaden the question into what do you do when something goes wrong, when your check didn't come, or you, seemingly fortuitously, get a big check out of nowhere. You can try calling Social Security. You can try going into their offices. I will also encourage you, every member of Congress has caseworker staff. I met Jamie Raskin's caseworker recently, and she told me they spend most of their time on Social Security and VA issues. They won't represent you, they won't be your lawyer, but they can sometimes get Social Security to look at something. You know, if you've sent something to Social Security 5 times and you've called them 10 times and you haven't heard anything back, sometimes the caseworker staff can get you a call back. Sometimes that's all you need. I will say places like 7 on your side can sometimes be really useful. In DC, there are legal service providers that are great. Many of them have income limits, but Legal Counsel for the Elderly, which is run through AARP, has some fantastic lawyers. The Legal Aid Society, similarly. There are also private lawyers who work on these issues. Most private lawyers in the organization that I work for, most of our members, are people who help folks get disability benefits. They're, you know, if you watch television and it says, have you been denied disability benefits? Call so-and-so. So-and-so might be a member of NOSCR. That's what most Social Security lawyers do because people tend not to have problems with their retirement and survivor benefits. Social Security tends to know how old you are, if you're married, how much you earn, and then they just pay you every month. There are, though, lawyers who will take retirement cases. They tend to charge by the hour for it. They have a retainer. And some of them will also even help with claiming strategies. They tend to be really expensive, but they also tend to work with higher income people for whom the difference between a correct and an incorrect claiming strategy can be a big amount of money over time. So the private bar, legal services, the members of Congress and their staff, the media, and Social Security itself. I will say Social Security is really overworked, and some of their staff members are better trained than others, and some of them are nicer than others. But just be polite, be patient, bring a book if you go there because you're going to be there for a while. Expect that it might take more than one visit, and don't hesitate to ask for a supervisor if something just doesn't make sense. But it is complicated, and when problems happen, they can be really challenging, because sometimes it's a check out of the blue, which sounds like a good problem to have, but is still a problem. And sometimes it's that a check doesn't come or a check is smaller, and that can be really difficult for people. So, Social Security is there to help with these problems. Sometimes they're better than others at helping, but give them the chance to fix the problem if there's a problem.
Stacy, thank you for a marvelous presentation. I'm afraid that your response to the last question may result in some phone calls from people in this room.
That's fine. I'll try and point you in the right direction.
Before you jump up, please, remember we recycle, and everything's beautifully organized back there. If you bring your plates and your food, put everything in the right place. Next month, our speaker will be Alan Krause, who is making a return engagement here, but his title sounds, I don't know whether that is what he's interested, anti-immigrant sentiment throughout American history. I think Stacy will try to get off work.
I wish I could, yeah.
There's one loaf of bread left. What's the status of our cookbook?
The new supplement will be out next month.
Oh, okay, I jumped the gun. Thank you, everybody. Stacy, thank you. Stacy, thanks.
So be it.